Welcome to our review of religion news in 2024. This is our last briefing of the year, and it's been an interesting year, to say the very least, of change and international turmoil which has spilled over into the UK. We've had riots, attacks on mosques, a rise in antisemitism and Islamophobia, a new government in the UK, and good words about the value of religion, but also the closure of the Interfaith Network after 40 years. We've had international uncertainty in Ukraine, the war in Gaza, then Lebanon, and now the fall of Assad in Syria. In America, the election of Trump. In India, community tensions and the opening of the new Ram Mandir temple in Ayodhya. In Rome, a global gathering of Catholics at the synod. And here at home, the historic resignation of the Archbishop of Canterbury and endless trauma for the Church of England over same-sex marriage and abuse. And joining us to review all these stories and the headlines, we have many of the journalists who guided us through, including Catherine Pepinster, Rosie Dawson, Amadit Bassi and Myra Butt. But we're going to start with Rosie, and who's joined by her guest, Kaya Burgess, the religion correspondent at the Times. And Rosie, you're going to be leading us with a review of the Church of England.
Thank you very much, Ruth. And welcome to you, Kaya. And Ruth has just given us there a whole, all the religion stories of the year and how many there have been. But this resignation of the Archbishop of Canterbury, where does that sit in order of magnitude in terms of the stories that you've covered for religion for the Times?
Gosh, that's a very good question. I mean, it so depends on what you're talking about. When it comes to the kind of the riots after Southport and some of the elements in there, clearly the kind of human impact of that was kind of huge compared to the resignation of a senior cleric in kind of the grand scheme. But, in the kind of constitutional terms, as an extremely kind of senior figure stepping down from their role, it really was quite seismic, especially given that in the however many centuries it is, the history of Archbishop of Canterbury, 1400 odd years, it is the sort of first instance of its precise kind. And so it certainly was a very big story that people outside the church would have taken real notice of as well as internally.
Yeah, I mean, I see that the Times letter pages are still going on the resignation. I mean, he resigned over the church's failures and maybe his own. He seems a bit unsure about that. In the wake of the Making review into the abuse carried out by John Smythe. One editorial I read said he simply had no friends left. He had to resign. But that was written before Thursday and his speech to the House of Lords. I mean, you were tweeting on that very early, and there was a big sort of reaction to that. Well, I have to ask, how did it happen, that speech? I mean, we're all wondering really that, aren't we?
It was surprising. I'm not easily surprised. I've been covering religion for 8-9 years and been at the Times for 16 years, and noticed that the Archbishop's name was down on the list of those to speak in the Lords, and it would be a valedictory speech on housing, which is an issue that he's campaigned on very passionately over the years. But I assumed it was likely he would make a few remarks about the issue that led to his resignation, and it just felt like it was addressed to fellow peers in the room with various sort of little jokes and in-jokes and so on to raise a chortle in the chamber, as if perhaps there wouldn't be people looking in from the outside. The tone of it was quite surprising. I simply just shared the video of the comments on Twitter, but without any kind of personal commentary. I just said these are the Archbishop's remarks about his resignation in the House of Lords. And it was the reaction that kind of came in from people who watched the clips and just sort of thought the tone of it was quite sort of flippant and frivolous. So I think were the words that other people used. Perhaps quite surprised. There was a line where he said, "If you pity anyone, pity my diary secretary," which in the context of what he had resigned over was sort of taken to cause some offence among people listening.
I mean, where does it leave the church internally on its safeguarding strategy, if there is such a thing? I mean, the Rochester Diocesan Synod has issued a vote of no confidence in the ability of the Archbishop's Council to handle safeguarding. When can survivors at all expect any sort of resolution of how the church is going to handle safeguarding and when there's going to be a proper process in place?
Well, when the Archbishop said that he had to take sort of institutional responsibility as the most senior, priest in the Church of England, there are others saying, well, I mean, that's something, but that won't solve the issue. As he himself acknowledged, safeguarding has improved a lot in the decade or so of his tenure in terms of the number of staff and the investment in the whole policy of safeguarding. But there have just been real repeated struggles. One of the big recommendations from the independent inquiry into child sexual abuse and numerous other inquiries was that there's a whole conflict of interest for bishops who are not only in charge of disciplining priests, but also in charge of their welfare. And would it not make sense for there to be essentially an independent watchdog to oversee the church's handling? But efforts to establish one have hit the buffers. One was started. It wasn't independent yet, despite it was called the Independent Safeguarding Board. And then that collapsed when the archbishops had to dismiss its entire membership. And so there's been this real struggle with how do they ensure they're not accused of marking their own homework internally to bring in some independent oversight, while at the same time not being seen to sort of abdicate all responsibility for it. And it just doesn't seem like something that has yet been figured out.
The other thing, I guess, that he leaves in mid-process is the whole living in love and faith process about introducing standalone same-sex blessings in church. This is due, I think, to come to synod again in February. Can that go forward without an archbishop in place?
Archbishop Justin Welby was deliberately quite careful most of the time. He made some more strident comments actually in recent months, but most of the time to try and keep his personal views out of those debates, to act as a figure of kind of unity for the different sides, both in the Church of England and globally in the Anglican Communion. And so he hasn't necessarily been playing a particularly central role deliberately, I think, in that whole process. So it can go ahead without him. The question is of how things will look. I mean, there's a system at the moment where parishes are still permitted to reject women in leadership roles, even though it's 30 years on from women priests. And there's a whole system where a parish can request a separate bishop to kind of oversee them if they disagree with their local bishop. And there's an idea that something similar will have to be put in place with same-sex blessings so that parishes who disagree can request another bishop. But of course, there are supporters of women's rights in the church who say that system with women is discriminatory and shouldn't still be there. And so some see it as a bit of a flawed model. But that question is going to be the big crux. And there's other unanswered questions. I mean, are they going to say that priests are now allowed to enter into same-sex civil marriages? Are they going to say anything explicitly on whether gay sex is now permissible within the Church of England's teaching, or are they going to adopt a more sort of don't ask, don't tell policy to couples who come forward for blessings? There's still a lot of unanswered questions, and we're now going to be 2 years on from when the vote for same-sex blessings first went through, so it's not a speedy process.
And whatever they do is going to be watched very carefully by others in the Anglican Communion. I'm quite struck by how little, in a way, we heard from the wider Anglican Communion about the resignation of Justin Welby. I don't know if you share that impression, and why that was. I mean, there was an absolutely excoriating editorial in the Episcopal Church of America's Living Church magazine, which would have said, Church of England gets rid of its leader and the spiritual head of the Anglican Church, and nobody bothers to ask us, to consult us on what we think. But there hasn't been a great deal. Is it just that people were very shocked? Is it that they already sort of see the Archbishop of Canterbury's role as, far less central than it was? Why do you think that was?
Well, I have been asking if people in the Anglican Communion would talk particularly about the fact that the process to choose the next Archbishop of Canterbury, there'll be 5 representatives out of the 17 total from the wider Anglican Communion, whereas previously it was only 1. And so just really asking them a little bit about what they thought about the Archbishop's resignation and the increased voice, but they have actually been quite reluctant to engage. And I think it's perhaps possibly a view of just wanting to see how this process turns out, and perhaps knowing that there's a greater global influence on the next Archbishop of Canterbury, being wary of weighing in on the resignation of this one.
So, I mean, internally, the church is clearly in a mess, if not at parish level, then certainly as far as national institutions go. And there's lots of distress in parishes and so on around this whole issue. And I'm just wondering, externally, how does the church recover its standing? You've got MPs, you've got peers saying, we've got to. The church has got to have an independent safeguarding process. It's got to get its house in order. We've lost confidence in it. And I just wonder whether you think that there's permanent damage done to the church from the outside, as it were, looking from the outside rather than the inside, or whether 6 months down the road, business as usual.
Well, I think one of the impacts, particularly when it comes to safeguarding issues over the past decade, and all of these reports coming out about historic safeguarding failures, has been, and I've spoken to bishops in the past few weeks about this, has been a further erosion of whatever moral high ground church leaders can naturally claim. And perhaps we saw that a little bit in the fact that Justin Welby's resignation came just a couple of weeks before the assisted dying vote, which meant that he wasn't really able to contribute. I know some people felt that loss and not having him there. And many church leaders stood up from different traditions and different faiths actually as well to say that they opposed it. And clearly MPs went with it in the end, and public opinion doesn't seem to have been swayed by those voices. When you've got a bishop standing up, assuming to have a certain degree of moral authority with the clerical collar and the mitre and the position, is that eroded by these constant reports saying that there are kind of moral failures in how they've been dealing with safeguarding? And some bishops I've spoken to have said that's going to be inevitable. Just that ability to speak into public debates and say, we believe this is the right thing to do from a Christian perspective. I feel like the public opinion may be less likely to be swayed. The question comes up constantly over, should there be guaranteed seats in the House of Lords for bishops? I wonder if the Archbishop's speech the other week may have lent some extra fuel to that particular question as well. But I think that's kind of quite a big issue that the church is facing going forward.
I mean, speaking about the role of faith in public life, we had the closure of the Interfaith Network. I just wonder, what do you think the impact might be, or of that has been, on the relationship between government and faith groups, and whether the government, with its new faith minister, Local, is making sure that those conversations still go on?
I've been structuring my whole time in the role of watching government struggle enormously with knowing how it's supposed to be liaising with faith communities, while saying nice things about how important faith communities are and the social projects that are run. I mean, the Church of England runs 30-odd thousand different groups, from addiction support and alcohol and night shelters and food banks. The last government was constantly unsure of who it should be liaising with from the Muslim community. It sort of did not like to liaise with the Muslim Council of Britain because of some sort of historic issues there. But I've also heard quite a lot in the background of kind of rows over which Muslim leaders should be invited to royal events such as weddings, funerals, and who are we happy to associate and who are we not. Westminster Abbey has one particular leader it likes to work with that the government isn't so keen on. This whole kind of complex thing. And just speaking as a journalist, I mean, some of the articles I've written in the last couple of years, particularly since the Hamas attacks in Israel and the violence since, is when there have been instances where Jewish and Muslim women, for example, have come together to go as a group to the synagogue, and then the next week to go to the group at the mosque and share meals and break bread together. They've been really well read by readers who feel very uplifted to see them. But having these sorts of formal networks can break the ice. It can be difficult, I think, for an imam and a rabbi and a priest, even though that sounds like the beginning of a cracker joke, to break that ice, to come together for those first moments, to address the tensions between communities. And funding for these sorts of networks is quite important.
Thank you. Thanks, Kai, for joining us. Hope you'll continue to contribute. I'm going to hand back to Ruth now. Thank you.
Thank you. We'll bring in Richard Allen Green at this point. Richard, you were with CNN, and now you're in London training to be a rabbi. And your last job at CNN was, I don't know what your exact title was, but head of the bureau in Jerusalem, which was a way to leave the profession, I must say. Listening to what Kaya has just said, I wonder if you have any reflections on community relations and how they've been affected by the war in Gaza and what's going on in Israel.
I was interested to hear Kaya say, and he covers religion in the UK, which I do not. So he's certainly the expert here more than I am. But from being involved in the Jewish community here in the UK, it is definitely the case that Jewish-Muslim relations at very high levels continue to take place. It is important that women go to the mosque and go to the synagogue and break bread together, but the leaders of the communities are also very actively involved in speaking to each other. Perhaps sometimes speaking across each other, to be fair, but those conversations do go on at top levels in Jewish and Muslim communities in the UK.
What has been your perspective since coming back to London on the way that the events in the Middle East have spilled over into the streets of the UK?
So before I went to Jerusalem for CNN, where I was bureau chief from February 2023 until the end of April, more or less, of this year. I did cover religion for CNN and for the BBC before that. And sadly, there is a very well-recognized pattern that at times of violence between Israelis and Palestinians in the Middle East, attacks on Jews worldwide go up. So there is always a spike in anti-Semitic incidents, physical and verbal and online and graffiti, whenever there is violence in the Middle East. And I think very few of us, if any, have ever seen the kind of violence that we saw October 7th and since then in Israel and Gaza. And so I think very sadly, but not at all surprisingly, we are seeing anti-Semitism like we've never seen before. We're seeing statistics from the Institute for Jewish Policy Research and from the Community Security Trust Religion Media Center's newsletter just today. Reports on the largest recorded number of anti-Semitic incidents on campuses, university campuses in the UK in the recent academic year. So there is a very well-established pattern, and it is sadly, performing to type.
In your contact with the Jewish communities here in the UK, and I know you've only been back 6 months or so, what has been the impact on British Judaism? When the October the 7th attack first happened, we heard stories of children being afraid to walk to school, people being afraid to leave their homes, taking away any physical sign that they were Jewish. Is that level of fear still there through this year?
There is a level of fear, absolutely. And JPR, the Institute for Jewish Policy Research, I think very shrewdly identifies what they call ambient anti-Semitism. So I think many of us will be familiar with the Community Security Trust here in the UK, the Anti-Defamation League in the United States. They record incidents of anti-Jewish behavior. JPR identifies what they call ambient anti-Semitism. So, for example, if somebody tears down hostage posters or defaces hostage posters, CST doesn't record that as an anti-Semitic incident. If there is a demonstration on campus which has calls for Zionists to be excluded from the campus and support for violence against Israel or against Israelis, those are not recorded as anti-Semitic incidents because there's no individual victim who can say, I'm the victim of that. But it creates this atmosphere of ambient anti-Semitism that Jews certainly are very aware of. And there is, I think, a painful irony in this for a lot of British Jews, in that the current Israeli government of Benjamin Netanyahu and of the far-right settler leaders Bezalel Smotrich and Itamar Ben-Gvir that is prosecuting this war is incredibly unpopular among British Jews. 4 out of 5 British Jews disapprove of Netanyahu. Smotrich and Ben-Gvir have negative they talk about the over-under. They have negative 78%, approval ratings, disapproval ratings. So I think there is also, some frustration with British Jews or among British Jews that this Israeli government prosecuting a war that many of them understand and would not publicly criticize and may, see the logic of in terms of Israel needs to respond, and the hostages and the deaths and the rapes and the burnings that occurred on October 7th, does not for many Jews translate in the UK into support for Netanyahu or his government.
So has it broken the link between British Judaism and Israel?
I think that link is very, very hard to break. There is some indication that it's happening at a generational level. At the level of leadership, British Jewish leadership is even those on the political left of British Jewish religious leadership who have said there needs to be a two-state solution. There need to be two states living side by side in peace and self-determination for the Palestinians. The chief rabbi of the United Hebrew Congregations, Ephraim Mervis, is on record as being in support of the two-state solution. But right now, I think a lot of Jews feel it's very difficult to criticize Israel publicly. Those conversations happen in the synagogues. They happen over Shabbat dinner tables. I think I think there will be a lot of very interesting Hanukkah parties this year. But I think a lot of Jews are uncomfortable publicly criticizing Israel in the middle of a war, which I think Israel certainly sees as existential. And I know I don't want to preempt your questions on Syria and Lebanon. The question of how existential this all is for Israel is interesting, but it is absolutely remaking the Middle East.
Right. We'll come back to Syria if we may, but I want to bring in Myra Butner, who reports for us on British Islam and British Muslims. And Myra, we've been hearing about the record numbers of anti-Semitic attacks, but this was also a year when there were record numbers of Islamophobic attacks as well. Can you give us some idea of the numbers involved and what this meant for British Muslims?
Yeah, so the Home Office statistics said that there were 3,866 hate crimes against Muslims in England and Wales in the period 2023 to 2024, compared with 3,400 the previous year. They said that 38% of religious hate crimes are against Muslims. So, and I think similar to what is it, Richard? Said they do tend to, those attacks do tend to heighten and kind of proliferate around times when Muslims are in the news or there's something going on in the Middle East, especially after 9/11. I think it's just been a kind of a constant thing that the Muslim community has been living with. And obviously those things can include, the direct out and out, they can be physical attacks, they can be verbal, they can be online. Islamophobia response unit is similar to what Rich was saying about the CST as well. Don't record anything online, for example. And that was really shocking to me when I interviewed them last month for the Religion Media Centre, because it was Islamophobia Awareness Month last month. And they just don't record anything. They're like, we don't have time. There's something if you go online now, you can see something every minute that is Islamophobic or that's talking about Muslims being terrorists or paedophiles or whatever.
This year we saw the birth of the Muslim vote, and MPs elected to Parliament as Muslims. So for the first time, a political party based on a religious tradition. I wonder what you think that says about the relationship between British Muslims and the state.
I mean, I think a lot of people voted for those parties and those independent candidates, not necessarily because they were Muslim, but because of foreign policy issues as well. So I think it shows that there is a huge level of disillusionment among British Muslims and the state. I think Saida Warsi has written a really great book actually recently, I know I keep going on about it, a book called Muslims Don't Matter, which kind of talks in detail about the relationship between Muslims and the state and the government. And obviously Muslims exercise their right to vote, their democratic right to elect the representatives that they thought were most suitable in those communities. But it was very much, there was a similar movement going on among, white voters in certain areas for reform, and there was a lot made of this kind of almost this taking over of parliament by the Muslims, and oh my God, what's going to happen, and is this creeping Sharia law and all of this, but there wasn't as much on the reform aspect. So I think it shows that people were disillusioned with the main parties, and I think the parties themselves also out and out kind of said, well, we don't really care, we don't really need the vote. And I think that was quite hurtful, because a lot of the Muslim community have supported Labour, for example, through the Iraq War and all of these things, despite like the fractures that created within the community, the war on terror. So I think for them, this was kind of a line.
Thank you, Myra. Just going back to Richard just for a moment to talk about Syria, the latest news from the Middle East. I wonder what your reflection is when you see people celebrating in the street, picking up what Moria was saying about international affairs spilling over into the UK, into our domestic politics. How significant do you think it is for Britain, from what you can see, that Assad's regime has collapsed in Syria, that we have Syrians on the streets, flags waving and so forth? As a commentator, as a journalist, how significant do you think this is?
I think, like many, I was completely dumbstruck that this, family dynasty that has ruled Syria for, more than 50 years would vanish essentially overnight. But this is, and I say this analytically, October 7th has not turned out the way Hamas planned. And I think Syria is by far the most shocking example of that. But look, yes, it created a wave of anti-Semitism. It prompted Israel very predictably into an incredibly brutal response against Gaza as a whole, not against Hamas, but against everyone and everything in Gaza. That's what Hamas wanted. But it did not prompt any Arab state to break off relations with Israel. It did not prompt even Saudi, which is playing footsie with Israel, to back away from the footsie that they are playing. It has given the Israeli government license to go after Hezbollah in a way that it would not have had license to do with its own population if it hadn't. I'm not saying I approve of that. I'm saying Israel saw an opportunity. Netanyahu saw an opportunity. The leader of Hezbollah is dead. The leader of Hamas is dead. The exchange of missiles between Israel and Iran showed that Israel has massive military superiority over Iran. Hezbollah is no longer available to support Assad. Iran pulled its supporters of Assad out of Syria. Russia is also a factor here. But if Hamas thought that October 7th was going to isolate Israel, I mean, okay, yes. If it thought it was going to create a wave of anti-Israel hatred, yes. If it thought it was going to fundamentally rebalance power in the Middle East, yes, but not the way they thought.
Interesting. Thank you very much, Richard. I think it's time to move on now to Catherine Pepinster, one of our reporters, and we're pivoting now towards the story of Catholics around the world and in the UK. Catherine.
Yes, thank you very much, Ruth. And I'm delighted that we have on the call today as well, Austin Ivory. Austin has been working as a journalist reporting on the Catholic Church for many years, but more recently, he has become one of the go-to people when you want to know about Pope Francis, having written 2 major biographies of the Pope, but also written a book with him. And I guess, Austin, that the problems that we were hearing about regarding the leadership of a church that Justin Welby's undergone, those sort of traumas haven't quite hit Pope Francis this year. But nevertheless, 2024 has been a major year for Francis, with the culmination of what is so important to his pontificate, which is effectively trying to reform the church, and he's done this through the synods that we've seen in recent years. Not everybody will be familiar with these on this call, so perhaps you could explain why this synod, with the rather unwieldy name of the Synod on Synodality, has been so important for what's happening in the Catholic Church.
Thanks, Catherine. I was just thinking, as you were beginning to ask that question about abuse, and of course, the abuse issue never goes away for the Catholic Church. And actually, Pope Francis this year, the Whitnick case has been very much, of course, in the headlines, and then more recently,
I'm thinking more about the Welby's downfall in terms of.
No, quite, yeah. No, and of course, Francis had his own annus horribilis in that respect back in 2018. But you're right, things are different now. The Synod on Synodality, so-called, was launched in October 2021 and has lasted 3 years, and has been described by many people as the most important ecclesial event in the global Catholic Church since the Second Vatican Council, and in many ways the most forceful event implementing the Council. So the way I describe it as it's not the creation of a parliament like we have, of course, in the Church of England, which the General Synod of the Church of England was delegated by the Houses of Parliament back in the 1940s to make decisions in a parliamentary way. Rather, it's the creation of a particular way of doing things in the Church, which involves consultation, discernment, discussion. And so even though the authority structures don't change in the Church, the Pope is the one who makes the final decisions with the bishops and so on, the way in which they get there is very, very different. So it's a change, but it's not just about decision-making processes. It's also about a kind of a change in the culture of the Church, the way we treat each other, the way authority is exercised. And so it's that deeper conversion, if you like, of a modus vivendi, procedendi, and so on, which is what this is really about. And that's been a struggle to communicate. And I'm not sure the Synod Secretariat has been particularly successful in communicating the nature of this new beast.
That's a very good point, because I know that a lot of Catholics in this country, in Britain, were very excited about the Synod and got very involved in discussions about what was going to happen, and then they feel as if it's all gone a bit quiet, and they're not really quite sure what's going to happen. But that will develop in the coming years. Meanwhile, something that they have got rather excited about is the fact that somebody who was so key to that synod, the Dominican friar Timothy Radcliffe, who spoke and guided the synod spiritually, he has been appointed a cardinal. And I think it's right to say, for the first time in history, we now have 4 English cardinals. Now, is this just serendipity, or is this telling us that kind of Catholics from Britain are now viewed as, rather effective and should be much more part of the kind of whole power structure of the Catholic Church?
Yeah, I wouldn't read too much into it from that point of view. So we have indeed an enormous situation, I think, indeed unprecedented. One of those cardinals, of course, Fitzgerald, who lives in Liverpool, is very old and wasn't out in Rome just now. I've just come back from Rome for this ceremony, which included Timothy Radcliffe as a cardinal. So we do have 3, as it were, active cardinals now that could take part in a conclave were it to happen over the next 6 months. Then all 3 of those English cardinals would be entitled to vote, which is extraordinary. But in fact, if you stand back from it, Timothy Radcliffe has just been made a cardinal. Really, it's in recognition of him as a theologian and a preacher. He's 79, so in 80, he becomes 80 in next August, which means he won't be able to vote. For next November, the Archbishop of Westminster, Cardinal Nichols, also hits 80. So in fact, after next November, we have 1 voting cardinal from England in the conclave. But still, it is a remarkable thing.
There is a problem, I would say, with the Catholic Church trying to sort of convey what kind of institution it is that right at the top are a lot of very old men. Pope Francis is now 87. He's older than John Paul II was when he died. He's older than Benedict XVI was when he resigned. You just mentioned Cardinal Nichols, who's still the Archbishop of Westminster, even though his retirement age has come and gone. And so what can people make of the fact that all these old men are sort of running things?
Well, I don't think it's been very different, has it, for a long time? I think
isn't it time for a change? I mean,
well, yes. I mean,
think about itself.
Yeah, I mean, just taking those separately, I mean, the fact that we haven't got a new Archbishop of Westminster, yeah, clearly there will be one this year. And I think that's just simply the fruit of the fact that there isn't necessarily a lot to choose from. And Nichols, and we're seeing this, with many archbishops, if they're in good health. So just to explain, when they reach 75, that's when they submit their offer of resignation. The Pope then, as it were, either accepts it immediately or sits on it, and the process to appoint a successor begins. But I think when the Archbishop is in reasonable health and so on, then there has been a tendency for them to carry on. But just in the consistory to create more cardinals that we've just had, 21 cardinals were created. Just to give you the numbers, it's now 140 voting age cardinals. Actually, two of them really raised eyebrows because they were very young. I mean, one of them was 44, another one was 51. I mean, imagine they're going to be voting in conclaves potentially for the next sort of 30, 40 years. And I was also very struck at that consistory how many of the new archbishops of major cities who are being made cardinals are actually quite young. They're kind of 50s, early 60s. So, I think there is an attempt probably by Francis to rejuvenate the college and rejuvenate the episcopate the best he can.
Well, we certainly need some fresh faces in the episcopate in Britain, because we had, in 2022, there was a whole embarrassment with the Bishop of Hexham and Newcastle having to go after he'd not been there very long at all. And then this year, they've made 2 attempts to find a new Bishop of Plymouth, and the person has chosen 2 different people, both had to step back just before they were installed. So there's an issue there, isn't it? A bit how they choose people, that they have sort of embarrassments where these people can't actually function.
Well, and that brings us actually back to the question of synodality, because one of the big themes in the final document, which concludes this 3-year process, is one of the issues is indeed selection of bishops, the way bishops are appointed, but also the whole question, if you like, of the agency and of the diocese, and this is true of parishes as well. In the Catholic Church, is no longer, I think, tolerable, frankly, to treat these as sort of corporate moves. In other words, the diocese waits passively for somebody who really knows nothing about the diocese to be appointed. So we're seeing in the final documents, called, by the way, endorsed by the Pope absolutely immediately for implementation, we need things like diocesan pastoral councils, we need parish councils and deanery councils. So there is much more, if you like, agency in these bodies. And I think that will make, I can imagine a future, for example, in which when a nuncio, that's to say the diplomatic representative of the Pope in a country, is thinking about the nomination of a bishop, he'll have in front of him reports or syntheses from these diocesan pastoral councils. He'll see their plans. It'll be much more, if you like, taking into account what those dioceses have themselves discerned as their mission.
That's very interesting. So that would be quite a change. It would be
and it'll take time.
And just talking about those dioceses and parishes in Britain, Austin, what do you observe about them? Do you think that they're quite vibrant? Are we still seeing the Catholic Church in Britain attracting a lot of people into them because of migration, or has that now come to an end as the numbers coming in from the EU have declined?
There's quite a dramatic trend at the moment in the Catholic Church across the Western world, and you're seeing it in a very marked way here in England and Wales, which is a quite dramatic falling off of what one might call the cultural Catholics, the ones who, as children went to Mass, inherited their faith, as it were, through school and family. And you're just seeing that they're now, of course, an older generation, but COVID particularly was a turning point there. In my diocese, Cardiff and Remunery, we lost something like a third of the congregation, and they didn't come back. And at the same time, you're seeing, and this is being reported across the Western world, but I've seen it in England and Wales, people coming at Easter, young people coming, however, not from a religious background, from an agnostic or atheist background. These are the so-called seekers, the believers without belonging. And so again, synodality is about adjusting to the reality of the church of the future, which is no longer a service station mentality where we have parishes dotted over the place, run by a priest, which people sort of attend out of duty, but rather much more, if you like, spiritual centers, which are missionary, which are cultivating missionary listening kinds of approaches. And again, if you read the final document, 50 pages of the synod, it's really quite remarkable how this shift is recognized in that document as being absolutely key to the future vitality of the church.
Austin, thank you very much for that very, very quick run around the Catholic Church around the globe. Thank you.
Thank you.
We have one more contribution from one of our journalists, and that's Liz Harris, who joins us. And Liz, you wrote for us in the middle of the year about a new Sikh court that had been set up in London. I wonder if you could just refresh our memories. What happened there, and if you know of its developments since then?
Yeah, okay. So I heard about the Sikh court. I think it was around early April that it was going to be set up. I got a tip off about it, and then reached out to the founder and got the story. They were saying, it's been sort of framed as a religious court, but then they say it's not a religious court; it's alternative dispute resolution framework for family and civil issues. And it was designed to take the pressure off the British courts and to try and settle things within the community, rather than, extensive, lengthy legal processes that cost people lots of money, and for people to be able to access experts, which they're not always able to afford. Just to say, like my source there at the launch just said to me, Riley, they say this isn't a religious court, and yet it's a completely religious ceremony, which is true. So it's a kind of bit of a strange beast, and it's actually it was very controversial within the community.
But just moving on to some of the other headlines this year connected with that tradition, there was a new $217 million temple, the Ram Mandir, which opened in Ayodhya with much fanfare and great celebration, and Modi was there. How significant was that?
Well, I would say, again, sort of broadly speaking, it's this big, symbolism of, Hindu nationalism. Obviously, it was built on the site of the Babri Masjid, which was destroyed in 1992. It's a real touch point. It's a real flashpoint. It's really, really sensitive, that whole issue. Because if you remember, the images from the time, it was torn down brick by brick, by Hindu nationalists, and for the fact that, the Prime Minister has inaugurated, this new kind of Disney World Mandir. Liberal Indian friends of mine, just all horrified.
Finally, one other headline in that tradition, the 40th anniversary of the attack on the Golden Temple at Amritsar, which gave rise to many protest demonstrations, if you like, in this country as well. Obviously, another flashpoint.
Yeah, absolutely. So every year since the destruction of the storming of the Golden Temple in 1984 in Operation Blue Star, every single year since then, there has been a demonstration. It's a kind of like a rite of passage almost for Sikhs. You go down in the, Sharabang from the countryside and spend the day in London. And this was the 40th year. And notably, the Labour Party have promised a public inquiry onto Britain's alleged role within Operation Blue Star back then. They've made this promise. I've got letters from Starmer himself, been trying to get it to internationals all over the place. Nobody seems to be very interested. And now the community... say the community, I don't really like that word, but, it's the Sikh Federation. They're kind of... Obviously, they know that, this was clearly a vote buying exercise, and they're trying to keep it on the agenda.
Thank you very much indeed, Liz. I wonder if I could draw some of these strands together. We've heard about the developments in each of the traditions. Can I ask all of the journalists to pitch in on this, please, starting with Rosie? What would you assess has been the influence of religions in Britain this year in public policy? Kaya, you mentioned earlier the assisted dying vote, but we've also had, we've had the election, and we've had Rwanda, we've had discussions on poverty, we've had climate change. Does religion cut through into the public debate? I wonder, Rose, if you could start and then others chip in, please.
I think you've mentioned the main ones, haven't you? If you were saying where did it really stand out, then I think the Archbishop of Canterbury on Rwanda, Easter was clearly one, and the assisted dying debate. I would say that those were the two that really cut through. I think the one where I didn't hear voices coming through publicly really was climate change. I mean, we've just had the COP, and there was very little that I saw, I saw, emails and campaigns and so on, but in terms of getting through into sort of public discussion, on sort of mainstream platforms, I really didn't see the faith voice on that coming through at all. I don't know if it would be lovely if somebody could contradict me and say that they heard it loud and clear.
Well, that's a really interesting question. I mean, I've been sort of following particularly the Church of England's efforts on climate change and their sort of struggles, really. A couple of years ago, they voted that they would try and hit net zero by 2045, but the synod said, no, we're going to make it 2030, which I think everybody involved realised was unlikely to happen. And if you're very cool like me and you read through all the church court judgments that come out, is constantly churches saying we'd love to install an eco-friendly boiler, but we can't really afford one. Could we please have a fossil fuel one? And judges going yes. Whereas in terms of, you're quite right about, in terms of at COP, for example, there were faith leader meetings there, and sort of various sort of statements issued, but they didn't really cut through into the debate very much. You're right.
And I wonder, Catherine, what your prediction may be, or how you assess the influence of religion, especially with the new government and great hopeful comments that were made in the run-up to the election that they were going to take religion seriously and everyone was doing very well. Do you see any action resulting from those fine words?
I'm afraid I don't. I think the new government's approach to religion is rather like the old government's, which is that religion is an area of society where they will engage because different faiths can contribute to an enormous degree to sort of bolster welfare with all kinds of work that different faiths do. They can be important in terms of social cohesion. So those are good things. They're kind of money-saving organisations, if you like, for the state. And then they are they're also problematic, of course. And as far as governments are concerned, if social cohesion isn't working, so they're either a source of help or a problem. One of the issues that was very interesting in the past year, Rose has already alluded to, was the assisted dying debate. And it was a moment where people of faith played a significant role in the public square, I think, and faith became something taken a bit more seriously. It's not just some money saving set up, which meant that the elderly could go to warm spaces in the winter. But actually, it was about how people perceive the world and their views on something profoundly important and a very ethical issue. So I don't know if we'll have more of that next year.
Ira, can I talk to you about engagement with Muslim communities in this country, and how do you reflect on the engagement that has taken place, particularly over the definition of Islamophobia, and what more needs to be done?
I think a lot more needs to be done. Obviously, there's still nobody's agreed on a definition of Islamophobia yet, which after the riots this year, which I completely forgot to mention, huge national kind of crisis. That needs to be a priority. And also, there is no official government engagement with a lot of the leading Muslim organizations. So there's been this policy of disengagement for many, many years since 9/11, which I think that needs to be something that the government obviously needs to focus on, and for those leaders that the government engages with to be organic and representative of the Muslim community. Because I think 90% of the people that are representing Muslims in the media are then they don't represent a lot of Muslims. They're usually fringe characters that no one's heard of. So I think that's to have those leaders accepted, and also and to be able to represent us and to have that definition, and for that to be taken seriously. After the riots as well, just to be quick, it just trailed off. Like there were people were being stabbed. There were mosques being looted and broken into, and it just kind of went away. Like if this was not to Muslims, it would have been going on still. We would have still been analysing it, but it kind of died down in a week.
Richard, I wonder if I could just turn to you for perhaps one of the final comments. And this is about the freedom of religion and belief. And just thinking about how important that is in the life of politics in America. And over here, we had a huge gathering, an international gathering on freedom of religion and belief only about 18 months ago. But now we still don't have a freedom of religion and belief envoy. The appointment hasn't been made by the government. I wonder how important you think that is for our society to have such a person, and how important it is for that issue in international politics.
Well, I will say, surprise, surprise, I am not originally from the UK. I was born and raised in the United States. And I think there is a really startling difference between the United States and the UK here, where America, the United States, is a deeply, deeply religious country, although legally no establishment of religion, and completely the opposite of the UK. I think we're all reflecting in various ways that religion perhaps punches below its weight in the UK, although there is an established church in it. And so on, and bishops in the House of Lords, and King Charles as head of the church. I am not wise enough to be able to explain why it works like that, but I do find it fascinating as an American living here. And the United States, a legally secular country, does have an anti-Semitism envoy, a State Department report on freedom of religion every year, in a way that the United Kingdom doesn't, which I cannot explain it, but I think the difference is very striking.
Finally, the last question to you has to be about the new president-elect Trump. You were telling me that this is one of the elections that you haven't covered as a journalist. You've just been watching from afar. What do you make of the fact that America voted for Trump, and what can we in Britain expect as the outcome of this vote?
To take your questions in reverse order, I will not predict what President Trump will do or will not do. I have learned not to make predictions, and absolutely not to make predictions about Trump. But again, if we look at CNN's exit polling, it is very striking, as is the norm. The Republican candidate, Donald Trump, a person of, dare I say, known flawed morals, not in keeping with all Christian teaching. Trump beat Harris among Protestant voters in the United States by about 2-1. If you break that down into white Protestant voters, he won by about 3-1. And if you break it down even further into born again or evangelical Christian voters, he won by about 4-1. So the evangelical Christian support for the Republican candidate, whether that is a tribal association with Republicans rather than Democrats, whether it is recognition that Trump was instrumental in bringing down Roe versus Wade, the national U.S. Freedom of abortion, or whether it is simply something that resonates among Trump, I think it's very interesting. I think it's very interesting that the evangelical support held so strongly for Trump in the face of, dare I say, his non-evangelical Christian personal behavior.
Thank you, Richard. Thank you to all our guests and all our journalists for that romp through 2024. We will assemble again early in 2025 to predict what we think might be the stories. But I can tell you that we didn't get anywhere close in our predictions for this year. So who knows what will happen next year. Thank you very much, and happy Christmas, everyone.